I want to introduce our next speaker here. So Dr. Peter Gurry has a PhD from the University of Cambridge and is an associate professor of New Testament at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he serves with Dr. Mead as co-director of the Text and Canon Institute. He teaches courses in Greek language and New Testament literature. He has written 4 popular and academic outlets and published 4 books, including being a co-author with Dr. Mead of Scribes and Scripture, the amazing story of how we got the Bible, which you can no longer get here tonight. He and his wife, Chris, have 6 children and 1 cat. And I was not told that prior to the event. That could have been an issue. Before coming to Midwestern, he served as a pastor at Whitten Avenue Bible Church in Central Phoenix. He has been known to enjoy cheap fast food, good typography, and a good Jack London story. He will give his talk titled Translating the Bible. Please greet Dr. Gurry.
Well, thank you so much. Scott, if it makes you feel any better, the cat did not make the move from Phoenix to Kansas City. So it's still there. It's still in Phoenix. Okay, the cat is fine, but we just could not fit it in the moving truck. It's a great privilege for us to be here with you. I think your pastor asked us tonight, when we got invited to Fairbanks, Alaska, was our first reaction like fear or intrigue? And I'll be honest, it was a bit of a mix. Okay, it's a little bit of a mix, but we are super grateful to be here with you. And I don't know if Holly's in the room, but let me just say a special thanks to her for putting this on. For this to be going for 15 years is really a testament to her passion for that, and she and the whole team here that has welcomed us so well this weekend is really to be commended. Yeah, give her a round of applause if you would. Yeah. And thank you all to those of you who cooked that fantastic meal. I was a little worried about you surviving the winter until that meal, but I think you're all gonna be fine. You're gonna be fine. Before I jump in, I want to show you one thing. Our website, textandcanon.org, and you all know how to correctly spell canon now, okay, has just an abundance of articles on the question of how we got the Bible. And Dr. Mead mentioned his article on why Protestant and Catholic Bibles are different, and that is really just a summary of the talk he just gave. Okay, it's a shorter version, but I would commend that to you. If you're like me and you listen to his talk and you thought that was really helpful, but I did not catch all of that. And maybe you have a family member or a close friend who's Catholic and has asked you this question, this would be a great article to point them to and say, this helps explains why it's different. Also, I think he asked you at the beginning, how many of you think, a quick story, I don't want to go over my time, okay, but remember he asked you about how many of you thought a church council had decided the Bible? Now, some of you were wise enough to realize he was leading you into a trap. I could tell, so you did not raise your hand, so good for you. But like 6 months ago or so, I was driving the car with my wife, and she was doing a Bible study with the ladies at our church, and they had picked the Bible as a subject they were going to teach on, and various aspects of the Bible, so like its authority, inerrancy, these sorts of things. And she got tasked with, I guess, the question of canon. And we were driving the car, and she says to me, I'm preparing for this talk, and like, I guess I've never really thought about it before. So like, a church council decided like the books of the Bible, right? This is no word of a lie. This is my wife, okay? My helpmeet. Now, and this is like, I'm not talking like 5 years, I'm not talking about like 15 years ago when we got, this is recent. And I was like, man, if only someone had written a book on how we got the Bible. I'm not lying to you. So all I just want to say, if you raised your hand, you are in good company, okay? Lots of good Christians think that's how we get the Bible. But in any case, this article is a really helpful corrective to that question, okay? It helps tell, where did that even come from, this idea that a church council did it, okay? So commend that to you. But do poke around on the website. We're going to talk about the life and legacy of William Tyndale here in just a minute. But if you go under articles, we've got all our topics, and you can go, some of you asked us about the Apocrypha during the break. You can click on that one, and you're going to get all our articles on the Apocrypha right there that touch on that subject. One thing that I like about our website is you can filter articles by level of expertise. So if you've come here tonight and you're like, I am ready for the red meat of the Apocrypha, Okay, there's like 2 of you who are like, that's me, okay? But you're gonna wanna click advanced and get all our advanced articles, okay? For the rest of you, you're like, I'd never heard that term before tonight. You can click on beginner and just filter at that level, okay? So we've intentionally designed it to be as accessible as we can make it. All right, so that's the website. Let me then jump over to our topic for the second talk tonight. And keep in mind, there's gonna be a good Q&A after my talk, okay? So hang on, because you'll get a chance to ask your other questions. But let's think together now about the history of translation, okay? We talked about the canon. How do we get these books, particularly for the Old Testament? We looked at that history now with Dr. Mead. But for most of us, when it comes to reading the Bible, unless you've been to seminary, you read the Bible in translation. And in fact, you have that in common with most people in history who've ever read the Bible and most people who read the Bible today. Most people encounter the Bible in translation, okay? And so first things first, I want you to think about some of the ways popular culture thinks about this question of translation. I was once in a used bookstore. This will not surprise you. I go to a lot of bookstores. I went to one today, actually. But I'm there in a used bookstore, and there's 2 ladies there, and they're in the religion section where I tend to find myself. And one of them is looking for a Bible, and the other one is there to help her find one. And she's pulling Bibles off the shelf, and she looks at one, and it says, New Revised Standard Bible, and she reads this out loud to her friend. And her friend says, well, that's a good one. She goes, no, I don't want the Revised Bible, I want the Bible. I was like, oh. So I'm over there like, like, oh, okay, where's this going? And then her friend goes, no, they've all been revised because the originals have been lost and they were burned, and so all we have are originals. And now I'm like, okay. Is this a test, Lord? Of course, I'm introverted, so I said nothing. And then I just tell you the story and I put it in the book, okay? But how do people think about this question, okay? When you talk to your unbelieving neighbors, how do they think about it? Well, here's how kind of popular media sometimes presents it. This is a cover story in Newsweek magazine from, I guess now it's been 10 years. But it still, I think, reflects kind of the way a lot of people think about this question of how we got the Bible, and in this case, translations included. The author of the article says, no television preacher has ever read the Bible. Okay, I'll grant that actually. Okay, I've seen a lot of television preachers. I do wonder if they've actually read the Bible. Okay, but then he goes on and says, at best, we've all read a bad translation, a translation of translations of translations of hand-copied copies of copies, and on hundreds of times. And you see the implication, right? The implication is, how can you take this book seriously? How can you claim to live by it? And then how can you dare say that other people should take it seriously too, right? And I just want to say to you right off the bat here, your translation, if you have an English Bible, okay, and if it's been published since let's say 1525. I promise you, you're not reading a translation of a translation, okay? It is true in the history of Christianity, there have been translations of translations, and sometimes that still happens when missionaries go overseas. They may go to a small people group and they're translating the Bible for the first time. They may go from English into that native language, yes? So occasionally it does still happen that you have translations of translations, but usually it's only 2 steps removed at most. Are you with me? Okay, but I think this is a fairly common way that people kind of think about how we got the Bible. It's just this long process, just full of errors and mistakes, right? And so I want us to think together about the history of the English Bible in particular and help dispel some of this myth for you tonight, okay? But before we do that, one more question before we really launch in. Why translate the Bible at all? Now, this is a good Protestant church. We've already established that from the last talk, okay? Because you don't have Tobit in your Bibles. So you're thinking this is like a silly question, aren't you, some of you? Why would you even ask that question? Of course we translate the Bible. But I want you to think for a second first about other religions and their holy books and their attitude toward translation. Some of you, maybe if you've ever gotten in a conversation with a very serious Muslim, maybe you've gone so far as to do your homework and you've started to read some of the Quran yourself so you can have better conversations with them. And your friend may say at some point, if they're really devoted Muslims, something like, well, you're only reading the Quran in translation, that's not really the Quran. Because the real Quran is only in Arabic, okay? So Islam as a religion has a bit different view of translation than we do, okay? Or think about another religion like Mormonism. Can Mormons translate their holy book again? They cannot, because they do not have the originals to translate from, Are you with me? Now, before we get sort of too critical, think about our own history as Christians. There have been some Christians who have not been super eager for the Bible to be translated, right? Okay? So this is why I asked this question, because I don't want us to take it for granted that we should translate the Bible. And in fact, let me put it this way. If you think this is kind of a silly question, that's good at one level, but that is because, in part, the influence of Protestant theology. And you may not even know it. Because Protestants during the Reformation made a big point to say, and here I'm going to quote some of them, okay? This is from what's called the Synopsis of Pure Theology that was written, and you can see the date, 1625, so this is old, okay, but right during the Reformation. And this was kind of like a key pastor's training manual, particularly for Reformed pastors. But it was widely read, widely used as sort of the standard textbook for pastors in training at the time. And it had a section on translation, okay? And look at what it says. Translation, they're talking about the Bible, of course, is not only permitted and useful, do you see that? But also what? Necessary. Do you see that? Protestants didn't just say we're allowed to translate the Bible. They said we have an obligation to do so that it can be read and heard by all people. Now, they had a really simple argument for this that I want to give you because I think it still works. In debates with their Catholic counterparts, Protestants made a very simple argument. They just looked at the Bible and they said, the Old Testament was originally written in what language? Hebrew. The New Testament is written in Greek. Now, I like to tell Dr. Mead that that's because God realized Greek is a better language when he got to the New Testament. But that's not actually true, is it? Why are they different languages? Have you ever thought about this? Why one language for one and a different language for the other? And the Protestants had a very simple answer that I think is the right one. They said, look, the Old Testament was in Hebrew because that is the language of God's people under the Old Covenant. But under the New Covenant, the dominant language of the time is Greek. Ergo, if God is willing to switch languages, it must mean he wants the people to have the Bible in their language. Do you see it? Very simple argument, and I think it's still true. So that's kind of one of my larger points tonight. I do not want you to leave here tonight taking the fact that you have an English Bible for granted, okay? So I want this question, why translate at all, not to be a silly one, but still one that you answer with a resounding, because not only can we, but we should. We must. Right? We have an obligation to. So let's dive in now to some of that history, this incredible history. By the way, English has one of the richest histories of Bible translation. We have such a long, rich heritage. No Bible translator today working in English, putting the Bible into English, is starting completely from scratch. Okay? There's every translator of the Bible into English has so much history they can borrow from and benefit from. Okay? So let's start with Wycliffe. You've probably heard the name John Wycliffe. There's debate among scholars today as to whether Wycliffe actually translates the Bible or whether he just inspires it. But either way, what's known as the Wycliffe Bible, named after him, is the first complete Bible into English, okay? And you can see it's early. 1382 is the first edition. There's a second edition in 1388. Before this time, you had parts of the Bible that were put in English, okay? Maybe certain famous stories or famous parts of it, like the Lord's Prayer, this kind of thing. But you didn't have whole books, usually, and you certainly didn't have the whole Bible, okay? And so Wycliffe very much inspires this first complete translation of the Bible. Now, one of the things that's going to distinguish his is that his Bible is not translated from the original. So it is a translation of a translation because the dominant language of the time, even in England where he lives, is, anybody know? Latin, that's right, or French in some cases, okay? But Latin is certainly the language of the educated, and of scholarship and all that kind of stuff, all right? So Wycliffe translates, or at least inspires the first complete Bible in English, okay? I'll show you a picture of it here in a minute. Now, then we have a pretty big gap, okay? Wycliffe's translation is not popular with the authorities. You probably know this part of the story, okay? They do not burn him at the stake because he dies of natural causes. But to make the point, they dig up his bones and they burn those, okay? So this is how it worked back then. All right, they couldn't quite get to him, so they got his bones. But his translation is banned by English law, okay? It is banned. We still have actually quite a number of copies, which tells you that people still bought it. They still made copies of it. We have several hundred copies actually of various parts, sometimes just partial copies of Wycliffite Bibles. But it was quite remarkable. Then we have this big span of time, okay? And then we get to Martin Luther's the guy there in the middle. And of course, you know a bit of his theology. Martin Luther translates the Bible into German. Now, one thing that people sometimes mistake is they think Luther is the first to translate the Bible into German. He's not. There are actually several dozen translations before his into German, but he is the first to translate into German from the original languages, okay? And then also, as we'll talk about here in a bit, he really puts it into the language of the people. And his translation is by far, at the time, the most readable. Okay, he really wants people to be able to understand it, and I put him up here not because most of us have probably never read the Luther Bible in German, but he inspires the next key figure, which is William Tyndale. Okay, William Tyndale is a student at the University of Oxford, where John Wycliffe had been a professor in the 14th century, and Tyndale is there at a time where Luther's ideas are starting to come across the English Channel, and he is starting to read Luther. Okay, he is a very good student, very good scholar. He knows multiple languages by the time he graduates. He learns Greek, and fairly unusual for his time, he learns Hebrew as well, as we'll see. And he is influenced by Luther's theology and thus by Luther's Bible as well. And so when he graduates, he becomes a pastor, goes back to his hometown. He becomes like a tutor first for a wealthy family, and then he's also a pastor. He preaches in various churches in his area. And he has this realization, he thinks, this is going to sound funny to you, I know, but he has this realization, boy, my people would understand my sermons a lot better if they could read the Bible in their own language. Can you imagine that? Imagine your pastor being up here and preaching to you, and none of you have Bibles that you can read or follow along with. And he starts to realize that they're having a hard time understanding my sermons because they don't know the Bible. That would be hard. All right? And so he starts to get this idea, and again, influenced by Luther and what he's doing over in Germany, Tyndale gets the idea that I should translate the Bible into English. Okay? However, the laws are still in the books. The laws have been passed following Wycliffe. So it is illegal to translate the Bible without permission. So he goes to London, and there he hopes to meet with the Bishop of London and get his permission and financial support to do it. But the Bishop of London will not see him and will not support him. And so it's while he's in London that he has the realization that he's not going to find good reception to this plan in England. The place that he wants to translate the Bible for is not going to help him do it. So he has to go to mainland Europe, he has to go to the continent, and it's there that he starts to publish his first Bible. So he publishes the first complete New Testament in English in 1526 from Greek, from the original languages, okay? He actually publishes one in 1525, or starts to, which by the way, this year marks the 500th anniversary of that one. He only gets as far as about 14 chapters of Matthew when his print shop is raided by the authorities, and he has to flee to another town. And it's there in a different city that he's able to finally complete the work in 1526. All right, just to give you a little perspective, chronology, the guy on the left there is Gutenberg, okay? So I put him up there to remind you that Wycliffe is working in a time before the printing press. All our copies of Wycliffe Bibles are hand copied, okay? And then of course there's Columbus there before Tyndale. All right, let's look at a couple pictures. This is a copy of the Wycliffe Bible, or a Wycliffe Bible, one of the earliest ones, okay? And if you were to look closely, or maybe if I had a higher resolution photo, you'd probably have a hard time reading it, both because the print is different, it looks more like Latin, but also this is a different kind of English. This is Old English, okay? And so you and I would have a hard time reading it. Genesis 1:1, for example, in the early Wycliffe Bible, reads like this: "In the first made God of naught heaven and earth." It's a bit stilted, isn't it? He's very much following the Latin word order at this point, okay? And so it kind of sounds like it even in English. But I want to point you to just one thing about this picture before we move on, okay? You see the page on the right, how it's fancier? Yeah, that's the technical term, by the way, fancier. And then on the left, a little bit less fancy. On the right is the start of Mark's gospel. What's going on the left? You're thinking Matthew, Mark. It's end of Matthew. It's not. It's a preface to Mark. You're thinking, okay, well, this is very interesting. I'm so glad you've come all the way to Fairbanks, Alaska to point this out. No, I want to point something out that's really important. All these early English Bibles have something like this, prefaces. Do you know why? Our Bibles sometimes still have them, don't they? But nobody at the time had ever been able to read all the way through Mark in English. Yeah? Nobody had a complete copy of the Bible in English. And one of the things that Wycliffe and all these early English Bible translators knew is that people needed help to understand the Bible. And these prefaces were designed to help orient the reader to this thing that was not very familiar to them. Does that make sense? I'll tell you one more story about how important these prefaces could be. If you were to fast forward to the age of John Wesley, you know John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, his brother, famous hymn writer. If you know the story of John Wesley, he tells the story of his conversion, of how he was at a Bible study and his heart was strangely warmed. Do you know what he was reading at the time? Not the book of Romans. He was reading Luther's preface to the book of Romans, which, by the way, that preface from Luther had been translated by William Tyndale, first of all, and he put it in his Bible. That preface is longer than the book of Romans. Okay? The Reformers really liked Romans, okay? As Protestants, all answers come from the book of Romans, okay? But anyways, all right, let me give you a little bit more context here for what we're talking about, okay? And when it comes to the history of the English language, one of the reasons why there's a big gap between Wycliffe and Tyndale is not only because of the laws in the book, that is part of it, but also because there's a dramatic change in the history of the English language. Wycliffe is working during a time of Middle English. Sorry, I correct myself from earlier. He's working in Middle English, okay? Old English is like Beowulf, if you had to read that in high school, bless you. Middle English is like the Canterbury Tales, okay? Early modern English, that's then what Tyndale is writing in, what Shakespeare's in, what the King James is in. It's still pretty understandable to most of us, although some of you are thinking, Shakespeare? Okay. Just to give you a comparison of another great piece of literature, okay? I just Googled great literature from modern English. Okay, anyways. By the way, sorry we ran out, okay? We didn't bring a checked bag. We should have brought more copies. But anyways, between this period of Middle English and early modern, the English language goes through a pretty dramatic change, okay? And in fact, in Wycliffe's day, I mentioned that, Latin was the language of scholarship, but also French was more important in England for most things than English was. But between the time of Wycliffe and Tyndale, English has, if I can put it this way, kind of come into its own. It's kind of become a respectable language. I know that sounds really silly to us because we think English is like the language, right? But at the time, even in England, English was not taken very seriously as a language, partly because the English language didn't yet have great literature. So even the Canterbury Tales is part of that shift that happens. So one of the arguments that was made against Wycliffe by his opponents, one of the reasons they said you can't translate the Bible in English is because they said English is not up to the task. It's not a good enough language for the Bible, okay? But that argument is pretty much not one you can make seriously by the time Tyndale comes along, because by then English has, as I said, kind of come into its own, okay? So again, just for some context, let me give you a little bit of contrast. I gave you Genesis 1:1. This is a comparison between Wycliffe's first edition and his second edition. And you can see from there, it starts to get smoother, okay? Now, the other thing I want to highlight from this slide is you see something already here in the very first complete English Bible that's going to be true for all of Bible translation history, not just English, but all translation history going all the way back. And that is this: translators love to revise their own work. It's one of the answers to a question I'm going to ask later, which is, why do we have so many translations? Have you ever wondered this? One of the answers is because translators like to improve their own work. And you can see it here already in the Wycliffe Bible, the very first complete translation. We get a revision by some scholars' conclusions before the first one is even done. Okay? Now, I think there's a simple, by the way, Tyndale does the same thing. I can show you this with Tyndale. Same principle where he revises his own New Testament several times. Why? I think there's a really simple answer here. The Bible's kind of a big book. Have you noticed? So picture yourself as, say, Tyndale translating the Old Testament. He's the first to translate it from Hebrew into English. And he finishes the Pentateuch, which is pretty good size, yes? He gets all the way through Leviticus. By the end of the Pentateuch, do you think his Hebrew's gotten a little bit better? Do you think he's developed some stronger opinions about how to translate and how to put it in? I think he has, right? So I think one of the reasons why we have so many translations is partly just because translators, they feel like they can do a better job. And when it's the Word of God, they want to do a better job. Are you with me? So compare that then We've got Wycliffe in the top two here. Now compare that to Tyndale, and now we really start to get to the English that sounds familiar to us. In the beginning, I've kept his old spelling, but in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, right? Tyndale, by the way, is some of the most familiar parts of the Bible you could thank Tyndale for, okay? He was a master translator by almost all accounts. As I said, he's very well educated, knew multiple languages, not just English, Greek, and Hebrew, but also German, Latin, French, etc. All right, here is a picture of the first complete New Testament in English by William Tyndale from 1526, okay? You see on the right here is the first page of John. On the left, I'm giving the first page of Mark, okay? And one of the things that makes Tyndale's Bible important is not just how readable it is, although it is, okay? You remember that Tyndale famously said he wanted it to be readable by the plowboy, the boy that drives the plow, right? Meaning the very common people, okay? And in that, he's following Luther as well, because Luther had sort of the same basic view. But it's not just the readability of his translation, although it is that. It's also something we probably don't think about that much, and that is the affordability of it, okay? This Bible was pretty small. And in fact, most copies of it, if you were managed to get one, did not come with binding. You had to bind them. And in fact, these two pictures you see, they're colored. That's been done after they were bought. They didn't come with a color. You had to color, so it's kind of like a coloring book too, you know? I mean, that's like bonus, but anyways, okay? So they were really affordable. Now, as I said, he's doing this from the continent in Europe. They're being smuggled into England, okay? One of the things that happened when he was in London is he did make friends with some businessmen there who would later help smuggle his Bibles into England for sale. But he was not popular with the church authorities and the king at the time. And so eventually Tyndale was hunted down. He had done it in the New Testament. He'd actually revised the whole thing at least one time. And then he had started on the Old Testament. He never finished the Old Testament, okay? Because he was arrested before he could finish and put in prison in a place called Vilvoorde Castle, which no longer exists, but it's in Europe. And on this slide, I've shown you two things that I think are really poignant and important for us to think about when we think about Tyndale's life. The one on the left is his last letter, and I believe the only letter we have in his own handwriting. On the right is the earliest depiction we have of his martyrdom, okay? Now let me start with the letter on the left. In the letter, he's writing from this castle in prison, okay? And winter is coming on, and he's gotten kind of sick, okay? And he writes to a friend, and he asks for essentially two things. One, he asks for warmer clothes, because he's getting cold, okay? But then second, he says, please send me my Hebrew books. Why does he want those? Because he wants to keep translating, right? So I want you to think about William Tyndale locked up, okay? He's being examined sometimes daily by Catholic authorities trying to get him to recant, which by the way is not to spare him from death. By this point, he was destined for that anyway. They wanted him to recant to save him, they thought, from the fires of hell. You with me? But he does not. And he's still at that point of his life thinking about translating the Bible. It's really amazing. One last thing I got to tell you about this period, okay? When he's in prison, okay, one of his most recent biographers says this about him. He says, at this point in his life, Tyndale has no reason to think that his life's work is going to be a success. Now, this is hard because we think of it as Tyndale, right? It's like this hero. But if I can put it this way, when he is in prison, Tyndale has no reason to think he will be Tyndale, right? This famous person who we all remember and celebrate. He doesn't. Why? Because when he was arrested, they confiscated all his stuff. He thinks what was left of his Old Testament that he was working on at the time that hadn't yet been published is gone. The Bishop of London that wouldn't see him earlier has been replaced by a bishop who is even more hostile to his work. Yeah? He has no reason at this point in his life, when he is martyred, to think that his work will be a success. Now, just really briefly, I'm not going to I don't want to preach here tonight, but I can't resist making one point, especially because we've been talking about Hebrews, okay? I want you to think about your own life and the areas of your life that God calls you to be faithful, that you will not see the fruit of in your own life. Yeah? There are things God calls us to be faithful in and says, but you will not get to see the fruit of them. Our job is to be what? Faithful, right? whether we get to see the fruit of it or not. And Tyndale is such a great example of that. That we stay faithful, our job is to stay faithful to God and let him handle the fruit, isn't it? He is put to death. You'll notice in the picture, it's accurately drawn in this sense that he was strangled first and then burned. The reason for that was out of respect for him as a scholar, that the strangling was part of the respect shown to him for that. So they strangled him first, then burned him. Okay. You probably can't see from here, but there's a little speech bubble. It looks kind of like a scroll coming out of his mouth. Okay, and these are his last recorded words. It says, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Because at his death, he's still hoping that God will change the king's mind and let the Bible be read and sold in his home country of England. And in fact, the Lord answers that prayer within a year, less than a year, of his death. This Bible here, you maybe never heard of, but it's important. It's called the Matthew Bible. And I believe it's the first Bible licensed for use in English churches. Okay. Now here is the end of the Old Testament. You see those two fancy letters there on the right? It may be hard to tell, but those are the letters WT for, guess who? William Tyndale. This is the first Bible, the King of England, the same King of England who was on the throne when Tyndale is killed and can't find a home in England to do his work. Same King of England, at the instigation of some of the people that work for him, approves this Bible to be used in English churches. Still not widely sold, but at least used. And most of it, or at least where they had access to Tyndale's Bible, that's what they printed. Okay, so there's parts of the Old Testament that Tyndale didn't get to, and so for that they have to translate it themselves. But where they had Tyndale's translation, the Matthew Bible adopts his words. Okay. I still don't know how the king didn't figure out WT is William Tyndale. Like, you'd think he'd look at that and be like, nope, but I don't know. Maybe he couldn't read those fancy letters. Okay. Now, let me show you one other fancy Bible from the important Bible from this period. Okay. This is the Coverdale Bible from 1535. Miles Coverdale is probably the forgotten hero of the English Bible history, but we're going to have to give him short shrift here again tonight, unfortunately. But I want you to show you, this is the title page to his Bible. Okay, so it comes out just about 10 years after Tyndale's. And it says, you can see the title, Biblia. It's Latin for books, or where you see get our word Bible from it. The Bible, that is the Holy Scripture of the Old and New Testament, faithfully and truly translated out of Dutch, that's their word for German at the time, okay, and Latin into English. So Coverdale's is the first complete printed English Bible. And he, again, like the other Bible we just saw, used Tyndale where he could, but he didn't always have Tyndale, and so where he didn't have him, Miles Coverdale did not know Greek and Hebrew like Tyndale did, so he had to work from German and Latin, okay? But I want to point out one thing from this title page, and that is down here at the bottom. I don't know how well you can see it. Do you see the king down there in his fancy robes? Okay? And if you were to come up closer, you'd see right where my laser point is there. Okay, I'll move it there so you can see it, but there's like a little book. And it looks like the king is handing the book to his bishops, his church bishops, okay? And this is Coverdale's way of saying, and most of these Bibles at the time come with sort of long prefaces, almost always addressed to the king or queen at the time, depending on who's in power, saying something like, "Oh, king or queen, you are the best, you are the greatest," all this sort of stuff. And you're the best because I know you're going to give this Bible to the people. Yeah? And the sort of the subtle undercurrent is, and you're not going to burn me at the stake. Okay? To put a fine point on it. So literally, the cover page here is drawing a picture, as if the king couldn't read. If you can't read, this is what I want you to do. It's not a picture of somebody being burned at the stake. It's a picture of the king giving the Bible to people. Now, that brings me to another point. At this period of history, you can't just print whatever book you want. There's no self-publishing. Nobody's got printers at home, right? Okay, there's no Amazon.com. The only way you can get a book printed and then published and then sold in English, you have to have the king or queen's permission, right? That's why this is such a big deal. If I could put it another way, translating the Bible in this period of history was always political. There was no way around that, okay? So it's always political. Now, one other point I want to make from this period is there are a lot more Bibles in this period than just Tyndale and the King James. Those are probably the two you've heard of, but there are actually a lot of English Bibles in this period of history, this first early period. You have Tyndale's, which I don't even put on here, but you also have the Great Bible, which we haven't looked at. Matthew's Bible, we saw a picture of that, Coverdale. But then you have the Bishop's Bible that comes along a bit later, and the Geneva Bible, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, in 1611, you get to the King James. Do you see that? Now, I point this out because I want you to notice that you are not among the first English speakers to have a choice in Bible translation. Do you see that? We're tempted sometimes to think, in the popular imagination, people can tend to think that King James is the first English Bible, there were no others, and then at some point everybody started making a bunch of them, and now there's too many, okay? But actually the period of the King James that we'll talk about in a minute, there's about a 250-year period where the King James dominates. That's the unique historical period, yeah? It's long, I grant you, but that's the unique period. It's unique to have only one English Bible translation. It's actually, in this period, it's normal to have choice, okay? Now, I'm not saying everybody could afford a bunch of Bibles, but still, there were, if I can put it this way, competing translations, just like there are today, okay? The other thing I want to point out from this slide is all of the Bibles in yellow here are essentially revisions of something that came before. And that's something that is also true in all the history of Bible translation, not just English, but the translators prefer, if they can, to revise another Bible rather than start completely from scratch. The simple reason for this is, again, the Bible is a big book. You make the job a lot easier if you say, I'm going to take a Bible that already exists and try to improve it where I think it can be improved rather than just starting completely from scratch, right? It takes a lot of work to do what Tyndale did, to start just from Greek and Hebrew and then go into English, okay? Takes a lot of work. The Douay-Rheims, by the way, I should mention that's the one in white. That is a Roman Catholic translation, not done from Greek and Hebrew, because by this point the Council of Trent has really elevated the Latin Vulgate highly. And so the Catholic view is that if you're going to translate the Bible, you should do it from Latin, and so that's what they do. The Catholic Church in general does not like any of these other translations, so it's kind of a case of if you can't beat them, join them. Right? They really didn't like these other translations because they viewed them as too Protestant. So they said, fine, we'll make our own. And then they put a bunch of study notes all through it saying, this is where the Protestants are wrong, that sort of stuff. It's even on the title page. I won't give you the full title page because they tend to be very long. But even the title page is basically like, this is the Bible from Latin to correct all those heretical Bibles. Okay, that's sort of a paraphrase. All right, let me give you some context here. There's Shakespeare. Notice he's before the time of the King James. So Shakespeare's Bible is not the King James. His Bible is actually the Geneva Bible, which I'll show you a bit in a minute. And then, sorry, I just can't resist, but here's King James. Okay, sorry. I'm so sorry. But listen, they gave me the late slot, so I have to keep you awake, okay? All right, forgive me. Okay, let me show you one more Bible. I could do talks on each of these Bibles, okay? Because there's so much to learn about them. They're all fascinating in their own ways. But I got to show you just one more before we get to the King James, and that is the Geneva Bible, okay? If it were not for the King James, this would be the Bible you think of when you think of the English Bible, okay? Because it was by far the most popular of its time, okay? Why was it popular? For a number of reasons. One, you can see the printing. When I've blown it up here on the right, the printing is more legible. It's not using the kind of Gothic lettering that most other Bibles are using at the time. This is what we call Roman type, and it's much more readable. Now, some of the words are weird, because you've got like what looks like a U for a V, that sort of thing, but it's much more legible. It also means you can print it smaller. So you can print a whole Bible in a much smaller format, and one of the unique things of the Geneva Bible is it was printed in all sorts of sizes and formats, okay? And that made it popular. But then there's another feature, and that is, you can see it over there on the left, that's a note, okay? The Geneva Bible was full of notes. Some places in the Bible, you get almost more notes than text. Romans again. Okay, sorry. Revelation, though, too, you start to get a lot of notes, okay? The third thing that's really innovative, I'll mention one other, but a third thing that's innovative is those little numbers. See those? Verses. This is the first complete English Bible to use verse numbers, okay? They had been invented in 1551 for the New Testament, okay? And this Bible adopts them there. Now, pause with me just for a second and think about verse numbers, okay? You're like, I've never been told to do that before. I know. Aren't they helpful? This is super, I always joke, like, how did they share the gospel at football games before verse numbers? You can't hold up, I don't know. Now, are there some downsides? You would never do it, I know, but I've heard that some people have been known to take verses out of context. I know, you would never do it. Think how much easier it is to do that, though. And think about the way verses tempt us to think that the biblical writers wrote in verses. They did not, okay? In fact, the first New Testament to have verse numbers, I'm convinced that a big part of why they were invented was because that first edition that had verse numbers was both a Latin and Greek New Testament, and the verses helped keep them in sync. Yeah? It was just easier to keep them in sync on the page, on the printed page, by breaking them up into smaller pieces, okay? It also, though, allowed the innovation of being able to reference very specific verses. You could say in a New Testament place, this is a quotation of Genesis, not just Genesis 15, but you could say Genesis 15:6 for the first time, right? Allowed you to be much more precise. Think about when Jesus is debating with other Jewish leaders of his day. Have you ever thought about this? How did they debate? They debated the Bible, believe me. People definitely have always debated the Bible. But how did they do it? Jesus could not say, haven't you ever read in Exodus chapter 3? So when he gets into a debate with the Jewish leaders about the resurrection, he has to say, haven't you ever read in the story about the bush? Meaning the burning bush, right? Okay. You have to know your Bible pretty well, don't you? To be able to debate like that. Because you have to be like, yes, I know what comes after that story and before it, and I know the specific part of it that he's talking about. Okay, one other innovation I'll mention about the Geneva Bible. It's the first Bible to use italics to mark places where the translators feel they need to use English words that, strictly speaking, are not in the Greek or Hebrew. Okay? If you use an NASB Bible today, for example, you still have this feature. And the one problem with it today is italics in English usually means what? It's emphasis, doesn't it? But when you're reading your NASB and you see italics, it's not emphasis. It's not like, hey, this is a really important word. It's actually saying, this is a word we think we need in English to make sense of it, but it's strictly speaking not in Greek or Hebrew, okay? So it kind of can have the opposite intended effect today. All right, so that's a bit about the Geneva Bible. Last thing I need to say about it is the Geneva Bible helps inspire the next Bible we need to look at, which is, of course, the most famous of all time, the King James. How does it do that? Because the Geneva Bible is called the Geneva Bible because it is made in Geneva, Switzerland. Yes? Now, I don't want to test your geography, but I think I can assume we all know. That's not in England, okay? Why are they translating an English Bible in Geneva? Answer, because it's translated by Puritans who were not welcome in England at the time. They were welcome in Geneva, Switzerland, where John Calvin and his friends were, and so they translated it there, and like the Tyndale Bible, it had to be smuggled into England. So what this means is it's not popular with all the English church leaders, and what happens is when King James comes to the throne, the King James of the King James Bible, when he comes to power, remember he's King of Scotland, he becomes King of England, the Puritans at the time had high hopes for King James. They thought he's going to come to power and he's going to take our side in these church debates we've been having. But he doesn't. He does, however, have a problem on his hand in that he has these Puritans, these pesky Puritans who keep wanting to reform the church more, and then his church leadership who want to be rid of these pesky Puritans, okay? And he has a plan. He says, I'll try to bring them together and get them to hash out their differences. Now, if you've ever been part of a heated theological debate, you know they don't always end in agreement, do they? And that didn't happen in this meeting either. At a place called Hampton Court in England, he brings the two sides together. They don't come to agreement on anything at this meeting except for one thing. In the process of this meeting, it gets suggested that maybe we should have a new English translation. And he gets both sides to agree on that. And that is the impetus for the King James Bible, okay? What's important, though, is it's King James's way of trying to get rid of this pesky Geneva Bible. Now, why doesn't he like it? He doesn't like it in particular because of these pesky notes. And one of these notes he doesn't like is right here on the picture. This is in the book of Exodus, here the blown up one is. And it's where the Jewish midwives, you remember this? When Pharaoh wants to kill the Jewish babies and the Jewish midwives come and they help them deliver and save the babies. And then remember when Pharaoh's henchmen come and ask him what's going on? They say, oh, these Hebrew women, they just give birth so fast, right? Remember this? And this note here says, their disobedience herein was lawful. But their dissembling, that means the way they explained it was not right. It was evil, okay? Now this is a classic text that everybody has to think carefully about is like, was it right or was it wrong? I'll let Dr. Mead answer that for you, okay? Or you can ask your pastors. But you notice what it says. Their disobedience herein was lawful. And you get a similar note in a place like Daniel, and you get some other places where these notes take real swipes at particularly things like the theology behind the idea of the divine right of kings, this idea that kings were established by God himself and therefore you couldn't challenge them. Well, if you're a king of England, you're like, I don't like these kind of notes, right? So when they decide to make the King James Bible, he comes up with a list of about 12 principles that the translators have to follow. One of those principles is no notes. No explanatory notes, except where absolutely necessary, but none of this like interpretive stuff, none of this commentary stuff. There's also things like he says you've got to use the old terms for certain things, like, for example, the word church is totally normal to us, but Tyndale did not translate the Greek word as church, he translated it as congregation. And that did not fit well with the theology at the time of the high churchmen of the Church of England or the Catholic Church at the time. So the King James, one of the principles is you've got to use what are called the old ecclesiastical terms. You've got to use church, okay, not congregation, or bishop, not elder, something like this, okay? Now, one misconception that people often have about the King James Version is that it's a brand new translation. It is not. It's a revision like so many other Bibles at the time. And here is actually a picture of some of the revisers' notes. They revised what's called the Bishop's Bible of 1602. It's the second edition of the Bishop's Bible. And these are actually some of their notes. You can see them scratching out words and adding words and all that, okay? Today, it's hard to imagine, okay? But the King James Bible was not a guaranteed success when it came out. And it was also not perfect when it came out either. English printers, one thing that's true at the time is English printers had not caught up to their peers on the European continent. They were not as good at printing. Now again, just think about the Bible. It's huge, right? That's a big job to be the person in charge of printing a Bible. Do you know, by the way, today there are whole companies that get paid to do nothing other than proofread Bibles. Have you ever found a typo in your Bible? Really? Who said that? Okay, I want to talk to you later. Because that's very rare. It's very rare, okay? Because proofreading is really carefully done today. But in any case, here's the first printing of the King James Bible, and here's where they duplicated about 3 lines of text in Exodus 14:10. The red lines get completely duplicated in green. Simple mistake, easy to make, okay? So the more famous mistake that was made in a later King James printing was in the 10 Commandments. Some of you have heard this. They left out the word not. This is a true story. This is a true story. I'm not making this up. So it said, thou shalt commit adultery, okay? That's not good. They did take these mistakes very seriously. The guy who was printed that, he had exclusive rights he was the king's official printer for Bibles. He was thrown in debtor's prison for that. He died in prison, so just keep that in mind. Anyways, all right, moving on. The King James Bible, though, is rightfully considered the most important English translation, okay? We get so many famous English phrases from the King James, oftentimes borrowed, though, from previous translations, okay? From translations like Tyndale or the Geneva Bible. But phrases like this, man after his own heart, thorn in the flesh, apple of my eye, at their wit's end, eye for an eye. All these are phrases that come. Some of these, like scapegoat, invented by Tyndale, okay? Think about Tyndale, one of the challenges he has. He's the first person to go from Greek and Hebrew into English. He's regularly encountering words in those languages and he goes, what do I do now? You know? So he invents terms like scapegoat, the term ungodly he invents. He's the first person, at least on record, to use the term atonement in a theological context. Is that incredible? Think about not having these words. And this is why I say, we take it for granted how much the English Bible has influenced our language, so that concepts that are just part of our vernacular actually come from the Bible. It's really a great privilege to have such a long history of translation, so that when you talk to people who've maybe never even been to church, some of these famous biblical phrases are familiar to them because they've so influenced our language and culture, right? Sometimes it can be a bad thing because the meaning shifts and that sort of thing. But now what happens is you get this 250-year period where the King James Bible is the English Bible. There are people during this time who want to revise it. There are people who don't love it, but none of those efforts ever take off. And so the King James Bible dominates for about 250 years. And I must say, part of that is thanks to the king, okay? Remember I said the Geneva Bible is actually more popular, but when it's done, King James says, okay, this is it. This is the only Bible you can buy and sell, okay? So I like to say, like, the King James is a really good translation, but it did have some help becoming a bestseller, okay? If somebody was like, the only book on the history of the Bible you can buy is Scribes and Scripture, if Trump was like, signing another one of those things that he always signs, like, only this one, I'd be like, well, seems like an abuse of power, but I don't know. I'll let it slide. But it would help our sales. That's my point, okay? That's my point. Sorry, I didn't mean to get political. Okay, but now, just think for a second with me what this means. Everywhere the English language goes in this 250-year period, the King James Bible goes with it, okay? It doesn't come over on the Mayflower, but it does come over to the U.S. very soon and starts to be printed in the American colonies. But it's not just America where English goes, is it? It goes to places like Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. Anywhere the English language goes at this time in history, the King James Bible goes with it and influences the English language, right? It's a tremendous heritage, and it rightfully deserves a special place in the history of the English Bible, okay? Now, what happens, as I said, not everybody's always happy with it. And between the period of the King James Bible's creation in 1611 and the next Bible I'm going to talk about in 1881, scholars start to discover more and more manuscripts of the Bible, particularly the New Testament. This is before the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there are some equivalent discoveries on the New Testament side of things that make people go more and more, scholars in particular say we need a new translation, okay? And that finally happens in 1881 with a Bible called the Revised Version, or on this side of the Atlantic, it's called the American Standard Version, the ASV, okay? The New Testament part of it comes out in 1881. The Old Testament comes out in 1885. By the way, that's another pattern you see in the history of translation. Almost always, a translator starts with the New Testament and then goes to the Old Testament. Why? Because the New Testament is better. We know that, right, Dr. Amin? No, sorry. I just had to make sure he's awake, that's all. Well, what's the reason? Why? Which one's bigger? Start with the New Testament. It's much shorter. Okay. And then we get, really what happens here is you get kind of, the door is cracked open with the Revised Version, and then it gets sort of blown open by the mid-20th century. So you get a proliferation of translations. It's sort of like people start to realize, hey, we can make new translations again. And so they do start to. And then you just get a flood of them. Again, all the ones in yellow here are actually revisions of previous translations, okay? Some of these will be familiar to you, like the New King James, the NASB, NRSV, ESV, those sorts, okay? We won't talk about all of these. I'm from Cincinnati, so let me just give you a little context here. That's when the Reds last won the World Series. Apparently also the last time they won a playoff game, because last week did not go well for us, or this week. Now, let me tell you about the Revised Version, okay? The Revised Version is the first and only official revision of the King James Bible, okay? Approved by British Parliament, okay? It's the product of over 10 years of work. A group of scholars works on it for about 10 years. There's plenty of politics involved then too, just like there was with the King James. But it is such a big deal when it comes out that they telegraph the entire thing across the Atlantic and publish it in the US, and they sell copies in New York City, okay? They sell out before noon, okay? Chicago at the time is sort of vying with New York to be the great American city. So the Chicago Tribune is the big newspaper. They do not want to be outdone by New York. So the Chicago Tribune takes out in their Sunday paper, this is from May 22nd, 1881, they print the entire revised version New Testament. The Old Testament would come along 4 years later, so this is just New Testament, but the entire thing in a special insert, and they sell hundreds of thousands of copies of this. Now, can you imagine a new translation coming out today, and the New York Times is like, all right, here's the whole thing for free, or for 5 cents, whatever it costs. Now, to be fair to the New York Times, which maybe you don't want me to be, but I will be, today, if a new translation came out, it wouldn't be as big a deal, would it? Because we do have so many. But in 1881, there just was nothing else. So everybody wanted to know what was different, okay? And plenty of people complained about it, okay? It's hard to replace a Bible that's been around for 250 years. It's the Bible people know, right? And so there's lots of criticism of it, but it does still crack the door open. Now, keep in mind, there's a long tradition of revision of Bibles. I mentioned this. So I want to just show you how long this sort of tradition is. Okay, start with Tyndale. He gets revised by the Matthew Bible, the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible. Okay, we didn't talk about all of these, but then that makes its way to the King James. The King James is a direct revision of the 1602 Bishop's Bible. Okay, now watch this. From there, then you just get this flowering. Okay, now this isn't like to scale or anything, but the New King James is a revision of the King James. The Revised Version, the one we just talked about, is a revision of the King James. By the way, the Revised Version is the British name. I said ASV, or American Standard, is the English one, or is the American version. Why that name? Because the American committee that was revising it took a few years to finish their revisions. And in the meantime, so many people printed bootleg copies of the Revised Version that when the official one came out, they had to distinguish it from all these other ones. So they said, we'll call it the American Standard, implying that all the other ones on the market are not the standard, right? Okay. But that then gets revised into the New American Standard Version. And you may know that's since been revised just recently into the Legacy Standard Bible. There's a 2020 version of the NASB. The RSV has been revised twice, in the NRSV and then the ESV. And now there's there's probably not anybody in here, but if any of you work in the Bible translation world, particularly the marketing department, can I suggest to you that you stop using the terms revised or updated because they're running out. The latest NRSV, okay, the NRSV is the New Revised Standard Version, but then you see this other one under it, Updated Edition. Folks, we are out of names. Okay, all right. Okay, but this brings us back to this question I already hinted at before. Why do we have so many? Okay, now there are multiple reasons. I'm going to give you about 6 here. We're not going to go through all these in detail, but let's talk about some of them. Translation philosophy, you've probably heard this one. It's a big one. We've only touched on it, really. I'll come back to it, okay? Manuscript discoveries, I did mention that though, didn't I? I said the Revised Version was done partly because scholars said, hey, we have older manuscripts now, particularly for the New Testament, than we had in 1611, okay? Now then, fast forward to say the 1940s and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That takes some decades for those to get published and to trickle down. But translators, once they start working through the Dead Sea Scrolls, are going, hey, our translations need to be updated in light of that new evidence, okay? Now let me pause here and say something about this. It's tempting to think that Bible translation works like some other things, like, oh, we wish for the good old days, and older must be better. And the King James must be better because it's closer to the original, yeah? There's a kind of logic to that way of thinking. But when you realize that actually what's happened since 1611 is we've discovered far more biblical manuscripts, and some of those are far earlier than what they had access to in 1611, your Bibles today are actually based on more and better and older manuscripts than 1611. Does this make sense? In other words, in this sense, it's not like the telephone game, that the further away we get from the starting point, the worse things get. Remember the quote we started with? That was kind of the attitude there, wasn't it? Oh, it's just translations, and it's always just getting worse. It's not like that. Your translations today are actually based on better manuscripts than the King James. And the King James is pretty good, right? You've heard it said, if the King James is good enough for Paul, it's good enough for us, right? Okay, well, I'm teasing. Okay, but truly, the King James is a great Bible. If some of you still use it, it's a great Bible. I think there's better ones, but it's still a good one. Okay, still a really good one. Theological concerns have always been a reason for new translations. Okay, the NASB was translated because the RSV was considered too liberal. We'll give you one example in Isaiah 7:14. It does not say that a virgin will conceive. The RSV says a young woman will, and puts virgin in the footnote, okay? So one of the reasons for the NASB was like, hey, no, we're not gonna have that in our Bibles, okay? Theological concerns of all, and I could trace this in the book, we trace this back all the way to the earliest translations of the Bible, okay? Why is this the case? Because all translation involves interpretation. It cannot be avoided. Remember I said the Catholics finally gave in? Said if you can't beat them, join them. We're gonna have our own translation. Why? Because translation involves interpretation, and they did not like the interpretations in the translations of the Protestant Bibles, right? It would be nice if there were Bibles. Now, don't hear me. This does not mean all translations are created equal, okay? They're not. There are some really bad ones. If you've ever heard of something like the Passion Translation, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're blessed, okay? The Passion Translation is not a good one, okay? I can point you to others that are these quack translations, not good, okay? But lots of our translations, our mainstream translations there are very good. But there are legitimate theological interpretations that come with those translations, okay? Changes in the English language, we'll come back to this, okay? But all you have to do is pick up a Wycliffe Bible and you realize the English language changes. New audiences, this is one we don't think about much, okay? But when the NIV came out in the 70s, I think it was the first one, it was designed for about a 7th grade reading level, okay? And it was so successful, there was nothing like it on the market at the time, okay? It was really successful. The publisher got an idea and said, wow, this was so successful, let's bring it down another notch. How about a 3rd grade level? Some of you are like rolling your eyes, you're like, oh gosh. No, but think about it for just a second. It wasn't because they thought like, let's dumb down the Bible. They realized there was an audience out there that for whom even the NIV was too much. And that audience was 2. Well, actually they list several, but I'll give you just 2. One was young kids, okay? And the second was people who are learning English as a second language. Okay, so they came out with what's called the NIRV, which you've probably never heard of, but it's still sold, it's still published. The New International Reader's Version. By the way, what time do I need to stop? When you're done. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what time I started, but I'm just keep going. I had some great dessert out there, by the way, so I'm like fired. And it's like midnight for me anyway, so whatever. You can tell I'm just going at this point. The NIRV, New International Reader's Version. In Psalm 23, the NIV said something like, he makes me lie down in green pastures, yes? Psalm 23, all in this. The NIRV says something like, he makes me lie down in green grass. Now, listen to me. As a sheep, I am not lying down in green grass. My good shepherd is going to make me lie down in green pastures, or I am not lying down. Are you with me? You cannot change Psalm 23. Stop it. But now pause for a second and try to imagine that you are learning English for the first time. Which word are you more likely to be familiar with? Pasture or grass? See? So translators and publishers try to think through, is there an audience out there that we're missing with the translations we have? And can we try to reach them, okay? They don't always do it successfully, but usually the motives are good, okay? So that's one reason. 6, all right, we gotta be honest, money, okay? As long as people buy Bibles, publishers will publish new ones, okay? Now, this does not have to be like, don't just think in terms of greed, okay? If you were to open your Bible, unless it's a King James, you would find a page before you get to Genesis, okay? It's a page that does not have your life verse on it. It's the copyright page. And somewhere on that page, it tells you how many verses of that translation you are allowed to quote before you have to ask for permission, okay? Usually it's between 300 and 500 verses, okay? You can quote up to that before you have to get permission. Now, for most of us, that's never an issue. You've never worried about it until now. Some of you are like, do I need to worry about it? You don't, you're fine, okay? But if you're a publisher, a Christian publisher, and you publish things like Bible study materials or VBS curriculum, right? What are the chances that you're gonna start quoting more than 500 verses? They're really good. You're gonna probably do it pretty quickly. And what that means is you may not only have to ask for permission, but that permission may come with a response that says, and you have to pay us some royalties to do so. And you may not know much about the publishing industry, but they're very tight margins in the publishing industry. And so that starts to cut into what your profits, okay? And a lot of these publishers are nonprofit, by the way, not all of them, but. So what publishers like to do is own their own copyright. And it will not surprise you then to find out that many of the major Christian publishers have their own Bible translation. So the NIV is at least published by Zondervan Publishers, okay? The CSB used to be the HCSB, but the CSB is owned by Broadman and Holman. Crossway owns the ESV. Tyndale Publishers owns the New Living Translation and the Living Bible, if you've heard of that, okay? They like to have their own translation because then they can use it in all their resources, all their commentaries, all their Bible study materials, VBS, all that stuff, and they don't have to pay anybody. I once gave this talk, okay? And I did not know this at the time, but the vice president of Bible sales for Zondervan was in the audience. Thankfully, she liked the talk, okay? She emailed me, like, that was really good, and thank you for not taking swipes at the NIV. She said, it was really good, thanks so much, whatever. And I had to reply back and I had to say, I do have one question for you. Was I right in what I said about this money issue? And she said, yes. She said, the only thing I would add is that you might tell your audiences that, at least for Zondervan, the money we make in profits on Bible sales, some of that gets fed back into sending free Bibles to other places and also funds other Bible translations. So I told her I would tell you, okay? So anyways, think about that when you think about money, okay? Can I say one more thing about money? This one I learned recently as well, okay? I did not know this before. The Bible, as you know, is a bestseller, right? And publishing has very thin margins. Publishers love to have books that sell lots of copies all the time. They love new bestsellers, but most bestsellers eventually run out of steam, right? They love to have books that are going to be bestsellers all the time, like Lord of the Rings. Like you could have a whole publishing company just publishing Lord of the Rings because you're always going to sell copies of it. Coloring books apparently are really good for this too. I didn't know this. But guess what other book is one of these? They call them not blacklisted, backlisted. They're books that have been published years ago, but they keep selling. The Bible is one of them. Okay? So if a publisher can sell lots of copies of the Bibles, that helps them. All right, let's dive into a couple of these a little bit more depth, but quickly. Translation philosophy, you've heard this one. You've seen almost certainly something like this spectrum. On the one end is word-for-word translations. On the other end is paraphrases, and something like thought for thought is in the middle. And even in our book, you'll find a chart that's something like this, trying to lay the different translations out on this spectrum, okay? This can be a helpful way to think about it, but I want to tell you, this way of thinking about translation differences is too limited. It's too limited. It's not wrong, but it's just limited. Why? Because the real issue with translating is not just, do we translate word for word or not? It really is this bigger question. Do we pull the Bible into our world or pull our world into the Bible's? And really it's not even do we, it's how much do we? Because think about it. If you say, no, I don't want to do that at all. I don't want my world and the Bible's world at all. I want just the pure, like the lady in the bookstore, right? I want the Bible. Well, okay, then I would say to you, great, learn Greek and Hebrew, right? The only way to keep the Bible in its world is to keep it in the original language. Translation itself is an act of moving the Bible from its world to ours, right? Because Moses didn't write in English. And Luther, as he characteristically did, just put a very fine point on this. When he translated the Pentateuch, he said to a friend, I want to make Moses so German that no one would suspect he was a Jew. No. Now, to be fair to Luther, he's talking about Hebrew idioms, okay? He's not saying I don't want anybody to know he's Jewish in terms of religion or something like that. He's talking about wrestling with Hebrew idioms, okay? But Luther said in another letter, he said, I want my Bible to be I want it to use the kind of German that the mother uses with her child when she's playing on the floor with him. So Luther did things like, novel things, like he went to butchers when he's translating Leviticus to be like, hey, what words do you guys use? Because I got to talk about all the insides of these sacrifices, right? He went out, he really wanted to use the language of everyday Germans, right? He wanted to be understandable, right? That is the tension that every translator faces. How much do I pull the Bible into my world, and how much do I try to make the reader go back into the Bible's world? So like your Bible may have something that does this for you, depending on your translation. At the back, it may have a table of weights and measures. Because things like monetary units for money, are one of the things that are most culturally specific, aren't they? So think, for example, if your English Bible uses the word dollar, that will not work in Britain. They don't use dollars. What's a dollar in England, right? They use pounds. So, for example, the debts in Matthew 18, the parable of the unforgiving servant, what are you going to do with the money units there, right? How many of you, let me put it this way, how many of you know how much groceries you can buy with the denarius? How many of you have seen a Leviathan at the zoo lately? Now, somebody, like a centurion, you're like, okay. Or if you've been around church at all, you know some of these. But other ones, you're like, they're very culturally specific, aren't they? So here's just how some different translations try to handle the difference in amounts that the servants owe in that parable, where the difference is the whole point of the parable, isn't it? So if you miss the difference, you've missed a lot. So the King James says 10,000 talents, but for the first amount, and then says 100 pence. That's not even going to work today in England. They don't use talents, obviously. Okay. So J.B. Phillips, a British paraphrase version, says millions of pounds and then a few shillings. That's not going to even work in England today. They don't use shillings anymore in England. Do you see the point? So look at the last one. The FNV is the First Nations version. Came out from Ivy University Press just a couple years ago for Native Americans. 10,000 horses and only a small horse blanket. I don't know how much that's worth. I live in a city. I have no idea. But do you see how it gets across the idea of a big gap in amounts? But the point is, whatever you do, whatever a translator does, they are asking the question, how much do I take the Bible from its world and put it into ours? And this then brings us to this other problem that English language changes, okay? Let me give you some examples, okay? In the King James, Psalm 50, verse 9, I will take no bullock out of thy house. That's actually kind of better today than the RSV. I will accept no bull, right? As they're like, hey, not in the Bible, okay? But 2 Corinthians 11:25 is once I was stoned. Now, some of you stayed with me long enough. You're going, but come on, Dr. Gurry. Context is going to clarify. Don't be silly. I know, but what do we talk about with verses? Isn't it true that often people read a verse in isolation? And so you could come away with it. And so hear me. Translators are not just asking the question, what English word do I need to use for this Greek or Hebrew word? Sometimes they're asking even bigger questions like, how do I make sure people don't take away the wrong understanding from this verse? Let me give you one example, the recent NIV. The NIV was updated in 2011, okay? In everybody's favorite verse, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, yes? Which means you can win your basketball game tomorrow night, right? The context there is Paul talking about suffering, not winning your basketball game, right? So the NIV 2011 has intentionally changed that verse to say, I can do all this through Christ who strengthens me. Do you see the difference? Why? Because they know if you put that on a t-shirt, it's not going to work. It's going to be harder to take that out of context. The word this is going to force you to ask what? And that forces you to go back and read it, okay? So translators are thinking not just what's the right English word here for this Greek or Hebrew word. They're thinking about larger questions and more difficult questions, okay? I say that not to say that all translations are equal, okay? I have my opinions. You can ask me about them in the Q&A, okay? But I want you to at least, before we start to criticize translations, to first ask, who are they translating for? Who's their audience, okay? And then to ask, what kind of challenges they had to overcome? What problems are they trying to solve with this particular translation, okay? And that brings me to my last and final point, and that is, if you're to ask, what is the best translation, okay? Here's my simple answer. It's yours. Unless you happen to be using some wacky translation, okay? You can ask me about it later, I can tell you. But read your Bible. Or if I can put it differently, what good does it do you to have lengthy debates about the best translation, and meanwhile yours is sitting on the shelf? Right? You and I are enormously blessed to have so many good translations. And here's how I'd say it. Any mainstream evangelical translation is going to be very good. That means NIV, NASB, ESV, okay? These are all mainstream evangelical translations. They're all good ones. Do they have differences? Yes, they have legitimate differences. We can talk about those. But they're all good. But they don't do you any good unless you read them. And isn't it a great privilege to have so many options? When there are people around the world who don't even have one? You can download a Bible app and have hundreds of English Bibles for free. So let's read them, right? If you want more, of course, well, we didn't bring enough copies, so let me skip that, okay? But thank you so much for your attention. I know it's late. I really appreciate you guys hanging with me.